Welcome to How to Sell Drugs, presented by Lucy, a podcast about drug culture, policy, and business with an emphasis on harm reduction. We believe that prohibition and abstinence-only policies result in poor outcomes for society. We'll be discussing how drugs are sold and, perhaps more importantly, how they should be sold. This is not intended to advocate drug use and meant for educational purposes only. Our primary sponsor for this podcast is us. If you or someone you know uses nicotine products, we encourage you to visit lucy.co to try our range of delicious and satisfying products that we hope you'll find much better than cigarettes, vapes, smokeless tobacco, and other traditional tobacco products. Today, I'm joined by my co-founder, Sammy Hamdouche. Hi, Sammy.
Hi, David.
And Kristi Knoblich Palmer.
Hello, how are you?
Hi. I hear you also go by KKP.
Yeah, that works.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much for joining us today. Kristi is a co-founder of Kiva Confections, which makes a range of edible cannabis products, and I'll let her provide some deeper background on herself now.
Yeah, totally. So I grew up in the Bay Area, California, went to school in the Castro Valley area, and went away for college in Santa Barbara. And that's where I met my now husband in photography school, and moved back up to the Bay Area. And the economy was tanking. This is like 2007. And so to make ends meet, we found ourselves looking to the cannabis industry to help out a little bit.
So how did that happen more specifically? How did you find yourself looking into the cannabis industry?
Yep. So like most starving artist couples in the Bay Area, cannabis offered another area for us to make money and make ends meet. And so we started a backyard garden shed cultivation, and that really got us into the dispensaries, and that eventually led us to the decision to go with edibles instead of cultivated plants, is what we were doing at that time. Clones, basically, like small cuttings of plants. And so we jumped into the edible space because there was a lot more opportunity, and no edibles at the time that were professionally packaged or looked like anything that we would want to buy or share with the people we knew.
Got it. And so you started with flower, got into edibles, and you guys had personal experience using cannabis products, presumably, before getting into this?
Yeah. So growing up in the Bay Area, cannabis culture is like just part of the experience of being somebody that grows up in the Bay Area. So it was pretty open in my family and in my friend circle. And so then meeting Scott, he grew up in San Diego. He was a bit more conservative. His family was a bit more conservative. Grew up to two teachers. And so once I he says corrupted, but I say enlightened him to cannabis, then you could really see that he really realized that there was no big deal about cannabis, right? I mean, you try it, you enjoy it, and it's really no big deal, right? All this prohibition is a bunch of hoopla for really no reason.
Yeah.
So it was
not killing a ton of people.
Yeah, exactly. And so, it was just kind of a natural way for us to go. We were young, hungry, naive. And I think all those things really were a blessing and led us to be a little bit more adventurous and take the leap that was required to get into the cannabis industry.
Great.
So when you were just starting out, were you making batches in your kitchen, or did you just jump straight to sort of a professional setup? How did that work?
Yeah, so we started in our home kitchen in the house that I grew up in, actually, and we worked in conjunction with the labs that were available at that time in the Oakland area, and really Kiva wouldn't have existed if there wasn't access to lab testing, and I say that because the labs allowed us to quantify the amount of THC in all of the extractions that we were using that would go into the product. And that was a huge part of how Kiva was born, because without that consistency and the ability to repeat the recipe every single time and make sure that every single product had the same amount of THC, we just wouldn't exist, because that really is what makes the Kiva brand succeed.
Sure. And so I think a lot of people who have experience with cannabis and experience with edibles, especially before the market got professionalized in large part due to Kiva, have seen a confection or let's say a brownie, right? A weed brownie, at least when I was in high school, was kind of the go-to edible, and people would make them themselves. And if someone told you those are some weed brownies, and then maybe they went to go grab a drink or go to the bathroom, you would eat one of the weed brownies, and they would come back and they would say, you ate the whole thing? You're not supposed to eat the whole thing. And you'd go, well, why did they make them in units of one if you're not supposed to? And then you would brace yourself for a extreme experience.
Yes.
And so that's one of the things. And I've used Kiva products in the past, and I'm a huge fan, by the way. And Kiva does this great thing where they have each kind of square very clearly delineated with regard to the strength. It tastes great. And, I'm able to really effectively eyeball a dose that is comfortable for me. And Sammy, I think maybe this would be a good time for you to share your Kiva story.
Yeah. It's crazy to think of a time, when you didn't know how much of a dose you were taking. Like it's amazing that like you could take something as potentially, potent as THC, like psychoactively, and not know how much you were doing, which is one of the big reasons I appreciate Kiva. But my first experience with Kiva, it sounded like you've heard a lot of people's first experience, was a little bit different. It was actually, with David, and he, one of the friends that he was living with at the time, just told me to grab a piece. And, my biggest problem with edibles generally is that they just they taste so good that you just want to keep doing more. And so I think I ended up doing like half of a bar.
Oh no.
Half of like a 120
it was like
or 180.
Yeah, when you guys were making them in like 180 milligrams.
Oh no, you poor thing.
And I had just had a big meal beforehand. So like it didn't hit me for like 2 hours or something. But when it did, I was in for quite a night. I have to say I don't remember a good portion of that, but I do remember that I told myself that I would from then on I would know how much I was doing.
Yes, oh, so important. Well, I'm sorry for that experience.
It's my fault.
It's so common though. It's crazy how often that happens to people. And then it's also interesting how when people recall their story, how their friends laugh about it, because it is a scary experience, but to this day, there's still no known deaths from cannabis consumption. So that's like the blessing and the light at the end of the tunnel is, even if you've overconsumed, you might want to die. You might hope that you will die.
Or you might think that you're going to.
I
I'm going to be the first one.
Yeah.
I came out of that experience thinking that I knew what it felt like to die. And I thought that actually kind of enriched my life in one way.
And but in fairness too, subsequently you have been a big fan of Kiva. You consume Kiva.
Kiva is my favorite cannabis product. I'll just say that up
Thank
front.
you.
And it's not because you're here. That's really true.
It's true.
You buy
that one
because you
not
know
it.
exactly how much you're doing. You know that it's consistent. Like you know that the quality is good. I haven't found a better way. It's the healthiest way to consume cannabis.
Yeah, we're very anti-smoking generally of any combustible plant material. I think, smoking cannabis seems to be less harmful than smoking tobacco, certainly. But inhalation of any kind of smoke, probably not ideal. Edible's probably healthier. And yeah, Sammy orders them in bulk and puts them in his freezer. And we are always laughing because Sammy's always trying to find where he can get the best price for the different, and so he's going and checking. So we are really big fans.
Awesome.
So I guess going back to kind of the business side of things, what were some of the initial large challenges that you faced as you were getting this company off the ground? This is pre-recreation. This is all medicinal, and it seems like there's a disconnect between state and municipal, obviously federal law. How did you navigate all that?
Yeah, so we got started in a legal environment where there were no regulations, right? There were no business related regulations. So it was certainly tricky to navigate. I would say some of the biggest challenges at that time was the lack of clarity around how to operate in an environment like that. So when you don't have any guidance, you're like, well, let's try this and see if that works. And let's locate here in Oakland and see how long we can last here in this facility, in this warehouse. So just that lack of uncertainty was super challenging. Another one would be banking. That's, I think, the low-hanging fruit of challenges is banking. So you can imagine an environment where you're operating in a growing business and all of your customers are paying you in cash, and your largest market is the LA market, and your headquarters is in Oakland. What do you do with the cash? And you literally have to drive it across the state. Yeah. So all kinds of nuanced challenges like that existed then. Some still exist today. So not all of that has been ironed out just yet. But also challenges around meeting demand. That's been a consistent challenge over the years.
It's a good problem to have.
Yeah, amazing problem to have. Another one would be hiring, finding quality employees. That problem has pretty much solved itself as legalization has really opened up the opportunity, and people are looking for the next opportunity in their career growth. And so cannabis offers a pretty unique position for itself.
Sure. And so I'm envisioning you guys are just like best friends with some mercenaries who drive Brinks trucks full of cash across the state is basically how it worked?
Yeah. We did a lot of that transport on our own.
Wow. Was that nerve-wracking?
Yeah, it is. The level of risk involved there is ridiculous, right?
It's dispensaries get robbed, or traditionally got robbed somewhat frequently.
Yeah, that was definitely a problem. And that was actually one of the benefits of having a manufacturing company or a brand and distribution company, because when you ask people like, oh, what types of businesses exist in the cannabis industry? They're like, grows and dispensaries, right? But they kind of forget that whole middle part of the supply chain.
Sure.
So we were able to kind of fly under the radar a bit, which was definitely a blessing. But yeah, it didn't come without its challenges and risk for sure.
And so from a supply chain perspective, you would source high quality flower and then extract the THC oil. And how did you do that initially? Has that changed as the business grew?
Yeah, totally. So, in the very beginning, we were making our own oils in our home kitchen, or actually in the garage. And my husband Scott, he basically set up a distillation system, an ethanol distillation system in our garage. So you can imagine opening the garage door, and that didn't really, if you weren't familiar with distillation, that looked like a much harder
like
core
Walter
drug.
White kind of situation.
Exactly. So,
Yeah.
So we started there with an oil, but back in the day, there was no way to clarify that oil or refine that oil as there is today. So you end up with a crude, basically, and it's this dark green kind of just an oil full of cannabinoids and plant material and chlorophyll. So you get a lot of flavor variation from that. So a few weeks into the company's inception, we abandoned that oil because we couldn't get a positive flavor profile. So we moved into a Coldwater Hash for our chocolate bars at that time. And that's a product that we still use today. Kind of a bit of a differentiator for us, actually, because oil now you can clean it up from a crude form and get a nice golden oil. But at that time you were unable to do that. So cold water is a bit of a, like I said, a differentiator for us. It's more expensive. It's a little bit harder to find. And really we've got roots that run deep in California now. So we've got sources that we can go outside of our company, but we also make that in-house at a scale that satisfies the demand we're seeing here.
And so can you describe that process a little bit more for those of us who might be unfamiliar, such as myself? Is it, I mean, I'm imagining like cold brew where you're just like soaking some kind of concentrated THC in cold water or something like that?
Yeah, it's you're pretty close. So the Coldwater hash making process, hash in and of itself is one of the oldest extraction methods like ever, right? It's been ice water hash has been used for many years, water hash many years. So it's a very natural kind of old school way of concentrating THC. So the way it was done, and the reason we brought it in house, so the way it was done was on a really small scale. So like you would visit a cultivation, they'd be making an ice water extraction. They'd have a big garbage can and like a sieve or like a screen, like cheesecloth kind of material. And then they'd throw the trim into that cheesecloth and agitate it with really cold ice water. And that basically knocks the trichomes off the back of the leaf. And that's what contains the THC is the trichomes. And so then those trichomes are in that water mixture. So then you have to run that water mixture through a series of screens to sift out the water and the THC from each other. Mm-hmm. And so the old school method is in a like a garbage can setup out in the field. Sure. But what we've done over the years is brought that process in-house to maintain quality and consistency. Because you can imagine the variation in quality when you're not at proper scale or you're not using the proper equipment. So that's something that we've done is brought that process in-house so that we can make sure it's done properly. Now the industry is at a place finally where we don't have to make everything on our own. We can find professional licensed operators in the marketplace that can match us or beat us on quality. So we have more options in which to source ingredients now.
That's awesome. And so it's almost like the opposite case of a lot of businesses where you gradually vertically integrate. You guys seem like gradually whatever the opposite of vertically integrating is.
Horizontally integrate. Yeah. So you're seeing, actually, it's a really strange time in cannabis right now. So you're seeing both models take place. You're seeing companies like ours that are like, let's focus on what we're really great at. Let's take the In-N-Out burger model and let's just make amazing cannabis confections. And then you're also seeing other companies saying, how can we recover some of the costs, or how can we cut out some of the steps? And they've got a big raise, a big capital raise that they've just done. So they begin to actually vertically integrate to make their lives easier potentially.
Sure. And so how did you guys source, and how do you source your base ingredients like flour, for instance? Yeah,
so we work with cultivators all throughout the state, but primarily in the Northern California region. Mm-hmm. So the Humboldt, Mendocino areas are super popular. And then some other areas coming up online are like the Salinas area. Mm-hmm. So that's becoming a big hotspot for cannabis cultivation, or has been for the past few years. And then the Santa Barbara County areas have also become really popular. And you're seeing now cities and counties position themselves for cultivation. So they're offering more competitive rates. They're offering lower taxes to operators as a way to attract them to their area. So finally, like our state officials and local officials are starting to recognize the true opportunities that cannabis has to offer.
That's awesome. And so it sounds like supply for flour is increasing. Is there any bottleneck? It seems like you were saying there are co-packers or co-manufacturers who will supply oil. So supply constraints not too big of an issue for you guys anymore?
So the constraints that we're feeling are less on the actual supply of cannabis and far more on the regulatory side and the specifically the issuance of licenses. So and to really dive into that, in 2017 Kiva did business with about 1,200 retailers throughout the state of California. Then 2018 hit when we got our recreational cannabis went into effect. And we woke up January 1st, 2018 with like 10 licensed stores that we could do business with. So cities and counties are, they're kind of using that like NIMBY perspective, like not in my backyard. Mm-hmm. And they don't necessarily want to license cannabis businesses in their cities. So we've seen a slow uptick in the acceptance of cannabis businesses. So that would be, I think, the biggest bottleneck right now.
So does that imply that Kiva, but if you were selling Kiva before, then it was medically allowed, and the medical dispensaries were still allowed to exist. So I don't quite understand.
Yeah, so in 2018, you're exactly right. The medical dispensaries were still allowed to exist until the beginning of 2019. And so we had a whole year there where they were still able to serve patients. However, as a company and operator that was issued a license, Kiva was issued a license, we could only work with other licensed companies. So those dispensaries, those we call them the Prop 215 dispensaries, the medical collectives, were still allowed to operate, but unless they had a license, Kiva could not serve them with its products. So we sort of got shut out of all of those unlicensed businesses, which make up a huge part of the market. So that's one of the big challenges, is without having enough license issued, we can't access those retail stores. So therefore we can't access those consumers.
So who can access those unlicensed dispensaries? Other unlicensed manufacturers?
Theoretically, yes, although that's not allowed. So those stores were supposed to have shut down at the beginning of 2019. So basically 2 months ago.
Sure.
And so they're not supposed to be supplied by anyone. They're currently not legal.
Wow.
But enforcement in the state is really low. Sure. We have seen barely any enforcement, both from local city police aren't enforcing, and the state hasn't really provided any resources. So those stores are still thriving. And the catch, I think the worst part is, as a consumer, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference really. And in fact, the biggest difference you would notice would be prices. So the prices in those illegal shops are lower because they don't have any regulations, or they're not getting a state license. So they don't have anything to comply with like the legal operators do.
Got it. So there's actually now incentives in the marketplace for unlicensed manufacturers to come in, challenge you guys, beat you on price, all the while violating the law. And you guys are trying to be good actors. That seems very frustrating.
Yeah, it's super frustrating. So it's part of the fact that California has such a robust cannabis marketplace. And then we gave, with the Prop 64, the recreational initiative that passed in California, we gave cities the ability to have all the control on how many businesses they wanted to license. So you go to a city council meeting and you see all the people in the stands. They come up and they say, well, what about the children, right? And you're like, well, there already are illegal businesses operating here. Right. So the children already have access to cannabis. So why don't we bring these businesses into the light, give them licenses, monitor them, regulate them, and then we'll have a safer, more above board cannabis industry, right, that we can all monitor, collect taxes from, and regulate. So we're just kind of stuck in this in-between phase where cannabis still doesn't have the normalization or the destigmatization that it requires to be to have more access and to be more normalized, really.
Sure. And so what do you think is the ideal solution? Do we need like a state cannabis czar or something like that?
Yeah, well, man. The ideal situation is that the local governments that where the cities, where the residents of the local city, if they voted yes on Prop 64, then that city should have to license businesses there. And it could be like a per capita kind of thing. So if you have 1 million people, you need X number of retail stores and X number of manufacturing licenses available for operators. So it's going to take it's a big fix. It's not like, oh, this one thing will help all of it. It's a multi-prong approach, but that would be a good start.
Cool. It seems like this industry could take a lot from the alcohol industry as far as how regulations are enforced and what the regulations are in the first place. Like, what are the parallels with how California, for example, treats alcohol and regulates alcohol, and what are the potential differences?
Yeah, I would say, and I'm no expert in alcohol regulation per se, but I would say the major differences between the two is I think it really comes down to the acceptance of cannabis right now, and people are afraid of it. So whereas take Budweiser, for example, in Fairfield, California, they have a massive manufacturing facility there, tons of jobs, and it's really an economic development agency. And so you don't get that with cannabis in Fairfield. They don't even have a way to apply for a license right now. So you're just seeing cannabis at its very beginning, and so people don't yet quite know what to do with it or how to handle it. There's still so much fear around having a cannabis business in your neighborhood. So I think that's a really big difference. Is the residents of the city have no idea how to treat this.
Yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, because I think we can all agree here that cannabis is less harmful than alcohol certainly in terms of number of people that it harms per year, and just the level of impairment and toxicity. In an ideal world, would you see cannabis regulated in the same way that alcohol is? That it would be available in places like convenience stores and in like bars, obviously not alcohol bars, but places where people can walk in and sort of order cannabis products, sort of in broad daylight. Is that what you would kind of see as the future?
Yeah, as a product company, as a brand, absolutely. That is like the dream of a cannabis brand, is to be on the shelves of Safeway or Costco or Whole Foods or 7-Eleven, right there where there's the most amount of access. I think we're a long time away from that, as right now cannabis products are held up in dispensaries, and that's the only channel in which we have to make our products available. And then you've got cities that are only allowing very few, if any, dispensaries at all. So that would be awesome. That's totally like the long game strategy for sure.
Yeah. Seems like it could be a very reasonable vision. I'm curious about, so it seems like the industry is evolving towards being a lot more professional, and there's still kind of maybe like remnants of a stereotype where people that are in the business of cannabis are stoners, and you obviously are very professional and have been very successful. But have there ever been moments where you've been dealing with other people in the industry as the owner of a dispensary or a distributor or something like that, or a grower, where you've kind of had to smack your head?
Yes, there are certainly some very colorful characters in the cannabis industry. And I have lots of great stories about all of the fun characters that I've met over the years. So definitely the cannabis industry attracts a unique breed. I do think that we're seeing more professionalism enter the space, as you mentioned, on a daily basis, because the opportunity is huge. And now we have regulations. So now we have a concrete foundation. It's still changing, so it's not perfectly, it's not a perfectly set in stone type of foundation, but we actually have rules now. So we know what we can and can't do, and that is really great for business and for investment, because it's that level of certainty that you need to continue to professionalize. So at the same time, we don't want to see all of the players of the cannabis industry, all the pioneers of the cannabis industry chased out, right? That's what gives the cannabis industry its flavor and its kind of homegrown nature. But I think at the same time, we do certainly welcome more professional people into the market.
Can we hear a story about a colorful character in the cannabis industry?
Sure. Let's see. So there is a dispensary operator who is actually still in the market, and he is a Buddhist monk, and just the sweetest person you've ever met, the most gentle, kindest person. He sits down in a chair next to you, and you're just like, oh, right? Like your whole body relaxes. You're like, wow, who is this person? And we used to actually source hash from him probably about 5 years ago. And the way that he liked to communicate about purchasing hash over text message and in phone calls was referring to it as a book. Like a book was a pound of hash and pages were grams of hash. So he would say like, okay, I have 2 books for you, one with 454 pages and another one with 350 pages, right? So you're like, okay, that's a pound and 350 grams on the side. So, yeah.
That sounds paranoid. It doesn't sound very zen. That sounds like he's trying to communicate in code because he's worried.
Well, and that was the times, right? That was probably 2014, and we didn't have any medical regulations. Like everybody was really taking a lot of risk. So even being able to communicate about this stuff over text message was actually like a big leap for the cannabis industry. There were plenty of vendors that only wanted to meet in person or wanted to use text messaging systems that were like off the grid, that were like totally secure and encrypted. So
why were you yourself not concerned, or maybe you were?
I guess Kiva always took a stance of trying to do things right from the beginning. So we were set up in a way that we weren't as concerned, I think, because we had put a lot of thought into the way that we set up our business. We were patients. We had a collective of patients. We were manufacturers. Again, we weren't necessarily in the cultivation space or the retail space. And if you looked at any number of cannabis convictions or issues in the operator space, they didn't really fall around manufacturing. So we felt a bit more, I guess, protected in a way.
And it sounds like being in Northern California, being in Oakland, and having, I assume, an open dialogue with your local regulators provided a certain level of comfort.
Yeah. There wasn't too much dialogue able to be happening at that point in time because there weren't really cannabis ordinances in place. So there still was a ton of risk. But I think just we felt like we were doing things right. And I think that acting responsibly and paying your taxes and just simply being a good neighbor, I think that gave us a lot of that kind of sense of comfort as well.
And so it seems like in the cannabis industry, potentially the biggest no-no is that you would not drive a truck full of product across to another state. Is that that's where people really, almost unanimously draw the line? Yeah,
that's that would be probably among some of the biggest risks that you could take in the cannabis industry. Yeah.
So is Kiva present in other states? And if so, how?
We are present in other states. And the way that we handle out-of-state expansion is to manufacture the product in that state. So we work with other companies in a licensing arrangement. So we actually license our know-how and our logos and our packaging to operators in other states. And then they have chocolate making equipment and mint making equipment that they use there to make the Kiva products to our spec.
Do you plan to buy equipment or those manufacturers, or how do you plan to expand? Is that on the horizon?
Yeah, so we'll continue to expand into other states, both with a combination of potentially licensing operations, or we may go in and buy our own license and set up our own manufacturing facility. It just kind of depends on the opportunity available in each state. So a teeny tiny state versus a large state. Those are considerations, right? Population. So the demographic makeup, also how difficult is it to get a license there? What's the competition like? And each state has its own requirements for getting a license, right? So some states require your bank statements to make sure you're properly funded before they'll give you a license, and others they just all have different standards. So it just comes down to the opportunity, the capital required, and a mix of things.
And does Kiva have investors?
Yes, we do. We took on investment in the middle of last year for the very first time. So we were bootstrapped up until that point, but with changing regulations and sort of the competition and the heating up of the market, Scott and I looked at each other one day and we were like, yep, today's the day. Time to put a little fuel in the tank so that you can overcome the changes, the vast changes that we were experiencing last year.
So how do you put that money to work?
So hiring people is a huge one. So we have expanded the team drastically over the past 6-8 months, bringing in, as I like to say, other people to worry alongside us.
Sure.
So it's really nice when an email comes in and there's the VP of sales and you on the email, and you're like, ooh, I'm gonna wait an hour until he answers this one.
Sure.
So sharing in the responsibility and the accountability of the business has been huge. And the reason it's great when somebody like that answers the email first is because they bring their experience and their skills from other industries into this one. And they have that experience to tackle some of those difficult problems and challenges.
Does everybody on the team use cannabis?
Ooh, it's not a requirement,
Okay.
but I would say probably 99% of the team does. Yeah.
How often do you use your own product, and what SKUs do you personally use?
Yeah. Let's see. I probably use our products like maybe twice a week. My favorite is our Petramints. So those are why I love that product is because it's 2.5 milligrams of THC per piece. So that's the product that you can eat. And then 2 hours later, you're like grocery shopping and you're like smiling at the spaghetti sauce and you're like, oh, which one should I buy? Right. And you're like, oh,
all of them.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, that's right. I'm feeling now I'm smiling and now I remember why. So I love that one because you can go about your daily activities and it doesn't throw you off your game. The other products that I love are gummies, and those just came out a few months ago. They have the most amazing taste. The flavors on those are amazing. The pineapple habanero is definitely my favorite. It's nice and sweet up front and then a nice little zing right there at the end. And 5 milligrams of THC per piece. So it's twice the potency of the Petramints. So great for sleep. That flavor happens to be uplifting. So amazing. Like take that, go for a hike, and you'll spend like 3 hours just kind of letting your mind wander and enjoying the sights and the smells more than you would if you didn't.
Sure. And so it seems like there's a trend that is happening across edibles generally, moving away from these products that initially seem to have to establish their efficacy of effectiveness by being super potent. And now there's kind of these micro dose type edibles. And so is that a continued sort of future area of development for you guys to go into that category? And who's the consumer in that category?
Yeah, certainly. So we'll definitely continue to pursue the microdosing strategy, and microdosing anything under 5 milligrams or less of THC per piece is what I would consider. And that really helps us appeal and capture that beer drinker or wine drinker consumer. And as Sammy mentioned, like it's really easy to eat too much and have a negative experience. And he actually came back into the edible space, which I think is asking a lot. Because it's easy to eat too much and that creates a negative experience. And so we really have focused on trying to help people get exactly the amount that they're looking for, not too much, right? We're like, eat just one or eat one square, so that way it's measurable for people, it's repeatable, and they can use cannabis responsibly to get the desired effect.
Sure. And so do you provide directions around, Sammy said having a big meal beforehand could delay the effects. Do you say maybe have this before your dinner rather than afterwards?
Yeah, we have some guidelines for consumption on our packaging itself. We do instruct people to start with 5 milligrams or less and wait 2 full hours before increasing their dose. So that catches most people who are experiencing edibles for the first time, who maybe eat a square and then 10 minutes later eat another square and keep repeating every 10 minutes until until then finally 2-3 hours catches up with them, and then they're like on the couch for a day. Yeah. So we try to slip information there on our packaging where relevant, so that people understand to go slow.
Yeah, that makes sense.
What are some of the limitations as far as why can't edibles work faster? Is that like a biological barrier, or is that something that technology can overcome? Is that something you were working on?
Yeah, so it is a biological factor of edibles. So if you consume an edible orally, then it has to go through your liver, and so it's that process of going through your liver that takes time. There is a lot of research being done around speed to onset, and so speed to onset technology is made to have the cannabinoids absorbed either through the mouth sublingually or in the stomach before it reaches the liver. And so there's a lot of research being done around that technology right now. Some companies are starting to use it, but not all that technology is working. So there's still a lot of development that needs to be done to really nail that speed to onset.
What do you think about CBD and some of these other pure cannabinoids that are starting to be extracted potentially at a cost-effective way? Is that something you guys are interested in exploring?
Yeah, so the CBD is really interesting, and isolating the other cannabinoids also really interesting. There's something to be said still about that entourage effect. And CBD, I think, is the perfect example of that. You're seeing a ton of CBD just out in the world, right? At coffee shops and chocolates and tinctures, you name it, there's a food company or a hair salon using CBD making some kind of promise. Yeah. But I think if you've ever consumed pure CBD and you're not currently experiencing symptoms that CBD promises to fix, often people will say, oh, I didn't feel anything, or it's not working, because CBD is only going to help you if you have symptoms that it can attack, right? So if you don't have any inflammation, then you're probably not going to feel anything from CBD potentially. Sure. So I think it's CBD's got a bit of a buzz around it right now as being like a cure-all, which I think is probably not where it should be. I think it's just like it's a trend. It's sort of like gluten-free, and everybody gloms on to eating gluten-free, even if they don't have a sensitivity to gluten. Right. I think it's the same thing with CBD. It's very trendy right now. But given all of that, I think the research behind some of these cannabinoids is really interesting, and it'll be fun to see how companies innovate and use cannabinoids differently. Other cannabinoids, CBG, THCA, THCV, you name them, there's hundreds, to really dial in effects and help consumers get what they're looking for.
Sure. And so there's some companies that, particularly in the vape pens, that claim that you can get different kind of effects based on the different THC to CBD terpene profile. What do you think about that?
Yeah. So I think it's pretty cool actually. So our gummies, for example, we're using a terpene ratio in that as well to help create effects. So you're absolutely seeing it in vape pens also. So I think that's just kind of the beginning of the innovation that can be done around both cannabinoids and terpenes combined.
Got it. And so how did people decide what those effects are? Do you have kind of like a focus group, or everybody at the company who is a cannabis consumer, you say, sit down, it's Friday, this is our version of happy hour, and now everybody go around and write how you feel? Or
we do some of that, yes.
Okay.
We definitely test internally and do studies internally with our own team, which everybody loves. And then there's also already research done on many of the terpenes. So like the terpenes that you find in lavender, for example, are studied and known to create a relaxing effect. So a lot of that research already exists and is available.
Got it. And then what do you think about people that mix, cannabis products with other products like alcohol? Is that something that you guys think can be done responsibly? Do you worry that maybe the effect of drinking and using cannabis could be problematic? How do you guys think about it?
Yeah. So I think, on the record, it's probably not a great idea to mix cannabis and alcohol, but off the record, I think the two combined responsibly is not too big of a deal. I think the general public probably doesn't know enough about cannabis consumption to safely mix with alcohol, but I know in personal experiences, consuming cannabis alongside alcohol actually helps me consume less alcohol, and I think that's I
found that too.
Yeah, it's a pretty common finding, I think, and you can have like a glass of something and smoke a joint or use an edible, and then you get a little bit of cotton mouth, right? So then you're continuing to drink water for the rest of the evening, which is kind of cool. Yeah. So it's a nice way to, I think, reduce in some areas like alcohol consumption. But, I think a lot of people too are speculating on how nervous the alcohol industry is about cannabis coming in. Well, I think that as consumers, we will use both next to each other. I don't have any plans to replace all of my alcohol consumption with cannabis because I don't get the same effect from cannabis as I do from alcohol, quite frankly. So I think the two can certainly live in the same place.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so then, switching gears for a second, how do you plan to respond to the rising competition of more people entering the cannabis space, more edible companies emerging? How are you going to stay on top of the competition?
Continue to make cool shit.
Okay.
Yeah, innovation for sure. So we're certainly not done infusing mediums with cannabis. There are a million things that you can put cannabis into. So definitely innovation on the flavor side, on the product category side, and then communication, marketing, telling the story, participating in podcasts such as this, just, continuing to get the word out there. People are absolutely starving for cannabis information. And so I think educational campaigns and just information forward campaigns are really helpful for people. And that's helping companies stand out.
Can you think of any marketing campaigns or types of marketing initiatives that you feel have worked especially well for you guys?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of in-store marketing over the years. We're just starting to experiment with billboards. The difference between in-store campaigns and billboards is in-store campaigns, you've got a cannabis consumer walking in the door, right? So if you are handing out free samples or a pamphlet, a brochure, you are putting that into the hands of somebody who is about to make a purchase. When you have a billboard, you're relying on access in the area to be available to that person so they can see your billboard, pull off the freeway and go into a store. And so, I think the in-store has been really effective, but in-store is getting pretty noisy. And so, and we want to bring new consumers in to the market as well, have them try products and get familiar with cannabis. And so we're dipping our toe into both areas.
Awesome.
So you made a conscious decision to focus on edibles at the beginning. Are you concerned at all about the potential health effects from smoking or vaping cannabis, especially as adoption increases, as it becomes less stigmatized, and people have this assumption that cannabis is, or they have the association of cannabis with health and with wellness, especially for CBD, that could be kind of a false a false signal, given that they're still inhaling or vaping something that is potentially toxic, not necessarily the THC itself, but the other chemicals that they're inhaling.
Yeah, so I think in California, our regulations are among some of the strictest. So, and that's around pesticide contamination, heavy metal contamination. So there's a lot of attention around consumer safety in the products that are being released right now. But it's still very new. So I guess potentially in years from now, we could see that there are some adverse health effects. And I think it's so interesting to see, like, you go into another state and another state, for example, may not allow edibles at the onset, or even in Canada, that's the case right now. So the only way to get cannabis is in a flower form or a vape form. So it's really interesting to see some places are not even comfortable allowing the consumption of edibles. They still believe that inhaling flower or vaping is like the only method to consume. So I think it's still all pretty new, but it does seem that edibles are the safest bet at this point.
I'd put my money on that. Yeah.
Do you have any advice for an aspiring cannabis entrepreneur out there who is very interested in the space and would want to get involved?
It's a tough time right now to get involved. So I like to tell people to be aggressive. Women in particular, actually, when they're looking at an opportunity in the cannabis industry, is the opportunity is now. We're in it, right? Like, if you wait a year or 2 or 5, it's going to be a different marketplace. But at the same time, it's a very difficult time to get into the market right now. People are raising insane amounts of money. There's these weird behaviors going on in the marketplace. Companies are pulling out all the stops and doing all kinds of strange things that you wouldn't see in any other space. So the rules of engagement are just a bit unpredictable and ever changing. So for a new entrepreneur, man, get ready, hold on.
It sounds almost like you're saying, don't even try to compete with me.
I hate saying that because I think competition is really good. It's really great for the consumer, and it's great for companies like mine because it keeps us on our toes and ahead of our game. And so I think competition is really important. I would never want to crush anyone's dreams. I think it's just important to be realistic about how much money it's going to take, how good is your idea, because there's a lot of people looking at the opportunity in cannabis, and it's really cutthroat right now.
Yeah, it's certainly a competitive time. Well, thank you. I think we've run out of all of our questions, so we really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you, Kristi.
Thanks so much for the opportunity. Really appreciate it, you guys.
Awesome.
Thank you.